Okay. So to begin, I wanted to start in 1862. We always start the history of streetcars in Washington at that time. Um, Roughly, streetcars operated in Washington from 1862 to 1962, so about 100 years. It was technically 99 years and 6 months, so just 6 months shy of 100 years, but we just round up at that point. But for the first part, what was happening in Washington at the time, we were in the Civil War at that time. And prior to the Civil War, Washington was considered a very small town, in some cases, considered a backwater by some estimation. But at the time, public transportation was relatively new to the country. It had only been introduced roughly in about the early 1830s in New York with a horse-drawn line. And so in Washington, just before the Civil War, the only public transportation that was offered was primarily through omnibuses. These were essentially stagecoaches that operated on a fixed route, primarily between the railroad stations and the hotels. And if there were any intermediate stops along the way that would be served by that, but there was no sort of comprehensive public transit plan that would serve the entire city. That would all have to change, though, because with the beginning of the Civil War, the demographics in Washington would begin to change dramatically. I believe in 1850, the population of the city stood at somewhere around 75,000. And then by 1860, the population had grown to about 131,000. And then you also had an additional, I think 200 to 250,000 of military people that would be encamped around the city throughout the war. So the demographics of the city and the region were changing because the population was just growing so rapidly. But you also had people that were coming to Washington to work in the government for the war effort. But you also had a large number of African Americans that were moving to the city that were being displaced as a result of the war. So newly freed African Americans that were coming up to the South were coming to the nation's capital. At that time, the first of the streetcar companies was incorporated. That was the Washington and Georgetown Railroad that was incorporated in 1862. And throughout my talk, whenever I talk about a streetcar company and receiving a charter, keep in mind that at the time that the city of Washington was under the control of Congress, so any charters that were received to operate public transit in the city were granted through Congress. So that's a kind of an interesting point to keep note of. So Washington and Georgetown is the first streetcar company. It began service in that year, and it operated just a few lines, primarily from, I think the first line was from the Washington Navy Yard, up 8th Street through Barracks Row, west along Pennsylvania Avenue past the Capitol, and then on out Pennsylvania Avenue, past the Treasury and White House on into Georgetown. So the image that you can see here is a photograph of standing at the Treasury building, looking east towards the Capitol with a horse car turning from Pennsylvania Avenue on to 15th Street. And so during this time, you would see the creation of a number of small companies. The Metropolitan would have been incorporated. That was the second streetcar company to be incorporated in 1864, and on up through the end of the war and into the 1870s. And then by the time we get from the 1870s and into the 1880s, you start seeing more and more companies consolidating, because at the time, public transit was a very lucrative, but also a very speculative business. So you had a number of companies that would have been founded during this time that would operate, maybe a line on a single street or a couple of streets. Within the charter agreements, they would often specify which streets the companies could operate over, how much fare they could charge, whether it's 5 cents or 3 cents, how much they could sell for tickets, what the track gauge could be, how often they could operate. And so these were some of the conditions under which they had to operate. But for the purpose of the Route 82 and the Maryland line, I'll refer to those interchangeably to refer to the line operating into Prince George's County. This next slide shows all of the streetcar companies that were incorporated or that had some dealing with either the construction of the line. One of the things that I learned about the construction of the line was that this was not, for lack of a better phrase, it was not a linear process. So it wasn't that the line started at one end and they built from that one end all the way out. The original plan for the line was to operate from the District of Columbia all the way to Baltimore. So this would offer competing service to the Baltimore and Ohio's steam railroad. And so what you see is there were a number of companies that were incorporated. I'll talk about as many of these as I can, but the idea was that they would build this sort of a high-speed streetcar line that would compete with the steam railroad. So the Eckington and Soldiers Home being one of the probably more well-known of these two, along with the City and Suburban. And then through a series of mergers and acquisitions, these companies were merged, purchased, bought in receivership, and then would ultimately merge into what would become the last three of the companies, the Washington Railway and Electric Company, which was incorporated in 1902, the Capital Transit Company, which was actually formed in the 1930s as a merger between the Washington Railway and Electric and the Capital Traction Company, which were the two big companies that were operating in Washington by that time. And then finally, the DC Transit Company, which would acquire all streetcar and bus operations beginning in 1956 and 1957. And then after that, they would operate until the creation of Metro in the 1970s. At this time, if you look at each of the companies that's formed here, each one, as I said earlier in their charter, would have some written in there somewhere how they could operate. So one of the reasons that the Eckington and Soldiers Home was so important was that it would provide access for the car line coming in from Maryland down what would later become Rhode Island Avenue, but it would allow access for the cars coming in from Prince George's County to operate all the way into downtown Washington. So with the mergers of these companies, the companies that would be formed as a result of that would have those rights to operate their cars over different trackage of different companies. So between the late 1880s and then the early 1900s, you start to see the incorporation of the companies. But the other thing that was also happening at this time was the change of power of how these cars were powered. With the beginning of streetcar service, they were powered by horses and mules. But then beginning in the 1870s and 1880s, you start to see experimentation with different types of motive power, ultimately resulting in electric streetcars that would start with the demonstration of Frank Sprague's installation in Richmond, Virginia, also in that same year. So while we credit Frank Sprague with the kind of most successful installation of streetcars, Mr. Sprague was not the inventor of streetcars. They were, there had been different experiments before that time. But what Mr. Sprague did with his installation in Richmond in 1888 was he was able to demonstrate how the cars and the power distribution system could work together to run multiple cars. So now, rather than having your streetcar system limited by topography or geography, because the horses can only operate for so long up a certain grade before, they have to be changed out, you can now operate this electric car that has almost limitless power to operate farther and farther away from the city center. So in, I believe, February of 1888, Mr. Sprague demonstrates his system down in Richmond. People from all over the country are coming to Richmond to see this demonstration done. So cities like Boston would take this technology back. With the West End railways, Washington would be no different. It would be with the Eckington and Soldiers Home. It was actually the first electric streetcar line to be incorporated in the city. All of the other lines prior to that had been horses and that had converted over to electric streetcar, but the Eckington and Soldiers Home was the first one to be incorporated as an electric streetcar line. So with that, we start to see the construction of the Eckington and Soldiers Home. It operates up through the Eckington neighborhood, coming up from downtown out New York Avenue, up to Rhode Island Avenue and then continuing on out to what would then be the District Line. And so with the Eckington and Soldiers Home, you start seeing that this is the first line to make it into the city. And the next portion of my presentation actually talks about the Maryland line. With the acquisition of all of these different car lines, what ultimately results is that by the early 1900s, you have a streetcar line that originates at the Treasury Building and then operates through Eckington, out Rhode Island Avenue, through the communities, Mount Rainier, into Hyattsville, all the way out to Laurel. By this point, it's also evident that while there was still an attempt to build a line coming down from Baltimore, because at the same time, there were companies that were incorporated within Maryland to build the streetcar lines down from Baltimore to connect with the line coming up from Washington. At some point, it was realized that this was no longer feasible, so the line would ultimately terminate at Laurel. But what was then known, it became known as the Maryland line. And so by the time that the Maryland line is incorporated, beginning in the early 1900s, what you have essentially is a one-seat ride where you can now ride from Laurel, Maryland, all the way into downtown Washington. Now, as I said earlier, the Baltimore and Ohio also offered service from many of the same communities along the Maryland line into Washington. But the main difference was that while the Baltimore and Ohio would operate primarily commuter service, so people primarily coming into the city during the day and then riding out in the afternoons, the streetcar service would offer somewhat more frequent service. So as opposed to a train where you might have to make your way to a station and wait for a train to bring you in or take you back out in the afternoon or evening, you've got a streetcar that you could conceivably walk to the end of your block or the end of your property, or a streetcar that would take you all the way into downtown as well. So it was a little bit cheaper as well because just depending on how rates were set with the Interstate Commerce Commission, they would set a different rate for how much a steam railroad could charge for a passenger to carry a passenger, whereas the streetcar line, the rate per passenger might be a little bit lower. So generally, it costs a little bit less to ride a streetcar into the city versus taking a steam train. But you had the one-seat ride, so that was one benefit. You also had the more frequent service. And what that allows is that it allows for the growth of these communities that were already existing in some ways, but they allow these communities to become really, truly connected and connected to each other, but also connected to the city of Washington as well. So now they've truly become what we would refer to as streetcar suburbs. This would be a term that would be used, describing any communities in the late 1890s and early 1900s that kind of owes in some part its growth to the streetcar. For the Washington area, we talk about communities like Chevy Chase, Maryland, Tacoma Park, which were served also by railroads, but also were served by streetcars. So as a resident of these areas, you would have multiple options on how you get down into the city. During this time, by the early 1900s, the line has been built out. But what was also happening at this time was the beginning of the ends of these streetcar lines, almost as soon as they get started, because with the early 1900s, streetcar services, continues to grow and prosper. Most people are relying heavily on streetcars to get around, because when we talk about public transportation, this is pretty much the main option that we were talking about. Some of the larger cities would have had, elevated trains or subway trains, but primarily when we talk about public transportation in the early part of the 1900s, we are referring to streetcars and trolleys. But what was happening during that time, by the early 1920s, you also start to see the rise of auto ownership. And then beginning in the mid-1920s, you start to see a decline overall in public transit ridership. So almost as soon as these lines are built out, they're completed, you start seeing people ride them for a few years. But then, after World War I, the price of an automobile starts to come down. And so now more and more people start to rely on their own private automobiles and a little bit less on the streetcar lines. And so as soon as we, with the Maryland line, one of the things I'll talk about is even though the line reached out to Beltsville by 1902, by 1925, the first segment of the line going out from Beltsville out to Laurel had already been abandoned, and the service was already starting to be cut back. So it didn't seem like much at the time, but it would really kind of start to indicate a trend that would go through the 20th century, ultimately culminating in this end of streetcar service on the Maryland line in 1958. So the next phase would be Route 82, and this is referred to because up until about 1935, the streetcar lines in the Washington area were referred to by their names or the streets on which they operated. So, they didn't have route numbers up until that point. So up until the 1930s, it was referred to as the Maryland line, or if you were riding out towards Glen Echo, it would be the Glen Echo line, or the 14th Street line, or the Mount Pleasant line. But with the introduction of newer equipment in the 1930s, they start to assign route numbers. The interesting thing about that, a couple of things. One is the route numbering system for the Washington streetcar system. If you think about going from the west end of the city, from Roslyn, Virginia, coming up across through Georgetown, the numbers increase as you go from west to east. So if you think about the Route 10 operating out to Roslyn, Virginia, the Route 20 that would have operated out to Glen Echo, the Route 30 going up Wisconsin Avenue, the Route 40 up Connecticut Avenue and Mount Pleasant, the Route 50 up 14th Street, Route 50 and 54, the 60 up 11th Street, the 70, 72, and 74 on Georgia Avenue, the 80 line on North Capitol, 82 along Rhode Island Avenue, and then the 90 out to Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast, and then the 92 operating down to the Navy Yard. The other interesting thing is that many of the bus lines that still operate today still keep these route numbers. So one way you can tell whether a bus line today was a streetcar line is, does it still operate with a number? And so with when the streetcars converted to buses in the late 50s and on into the DC Transit and into the Metrobus era, even today, the buses that operate out along, Rhode Island Avenue and serve into Prince George's County still have some variations of 80s, so the 83s, the 84s, so all of that was kept in place. The other thing that was going on during this time was, as I said earlier, transit ridership was still continuing to decline through the 1930s, and especially with the Depression, because transit ridership was primarily transit ridership was primarily done with rush hour trips. So primarily people going to and from work was usually when the peaks of transit ridership occurred. So with more and more people being laid off and losing their jobs as a result of the Depression, transit ridership continues to take a nosedive. This would change, though, with America's entry into World War II. So during the war years, you see a spike in transit ridership, because of the rationing of gas and rubber. So streetcar ridership primarily, because streetcars use neither. So streetcar ridership in the Washington, D.C. area also increases significantly, in addition to, again, another jump in population with people coming into the Washington area, similar to the Civil War, to work for the war effort, either in the government or defense jobs or in the military. But after the war, the Route 82, along with many other streetcar lines, begins that slow decline again, with transit ridership falling off, this time as a result of continued increased auto ownership after the war. More people were able to buy cars. But this time, there's also an increase in suburbanization, but not along transit lines, with the big shift being the introduction of the interstate highway system in the 50s, and the construction of new subdivisions, funded by either FHA or VA loans. You start to see the construction of these new suburbs far from the city center that don't require streetcars or buses. They are designed to be mainly auto-centric. So now people who had maybe formerly lived in the city can now buy a home out in the suburbs and own a car and then drive into the city every day. So they don't have to rely on the streetcar or the bus. And so throughout the 50s, you start seeing a decline in transit ridership that continues. And then really in 1955 through 1958, there were some, I describe them as almost shocks to the streetcar system that would ultimately result in the conversion of buses in 1962. 1958, though, being the last year of the operation of the routes 80 and 82 streetcar lines. And the conversion of those lines was really the first in the series of conversions that began with the conversion of the Route 80 and 82, and then ended in January of 1962 with the final conversions of the 14th Street and the U Street lines that would end streetcar service in the nation's capital. One sort of respite during that time was, of course, the arrival of the PCC car. Recognizing by the late 1920s that there was a downward trend in transit ridership, the presidents of the major streetcar companies in the United States, as well as the major streetcar builders, formed a committee called the Electric Railway President's Conference Committee that would come together and put together forth money and research that would ultimately lead to the development of the PCC, President's Conference Committee car. This was a car that was introduced to Washington beginning in 1937 and would operate up until the end of streetcar service in 1962. So if anyone remembers riding any of the streetcars in Washington during that time, it was most likely on a car like the one that you see pictured here. But these cars were a major shift. It was really an attempt to make the car a much more comfortable and inviting ride and to lure people back onto public transit. These cars were introduced right before World War II. Washington would ultimately operate about 489 of these types of cars. So it was one of the largest users of these cars. They were well received. Cars would be introduced, of course, to the Maryland line beginning in the 1930s. However, the line operating from Berwyn out to what would then be Beltsville by that point was still operated with older double-end equipment. There were no turning loops that were built beyond Berwyn, or at Branchville. So the PCC cars never operated out past that point. But the PCC car did kind of slow down the decline in ridership, but it would ultimately, while it was a success from a technological advantage, I mean, there are still a number of systems today that operate PCC cars, and there are a number of PCC cars that still survive in museums. It could not kind of stem the tide of the overall decline in transit ridership that would continue after the war years. The other spike, as I mentioned earlier, the spike in ridership during World War II, this slogan that you see here, serving Washington, which serves the nation, was the motto of the Capital Transit Company during that time. Recognizing that, public transit in the nation's capital was of the utmost importance and very important to the war effort, Washington would receive a lot of additional cars during that time, usually because even with the war effort, a number of things, including streetcars, were also being rationed. So orders would be put in from systems all around the country, but they would go through some sort of a review through the Office of Defense Transportation, which would evaluate which systems would kind of deserve new equipment and kind of the importance. So large industrial cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia would continue to receive cars. Washington, of course, would receive its cars because of the war effort and the people that were relying heavily on public transit to and from their jobs, either in the war industry or in the government. But I also kind of wanted to point out this photograph here, because it's I thought it was a great photo because it shows in a by the mid-1950s, you begin to see successful attempts at desegregation. So in 1955, Capital Transit by that, or DC Transit, I should say, by that point, begins to hire its first new two streetcar operators. I think one on streetcars operating out of the 14th Street division, and then one out of the bus division. So you see that success. But also what was happening during that time in Washington was there was a change in corporate leadership, which would ultimately lead to the end of streetcar service, because at the time it went from becoming the Capital Transit Company. There was a gentleman by the name of Lewis Wolfson who came in and purchased the company, because even up until the 40s and 50s, many of the streetcar companies and transit companies in the United States were privately owned. So they still had board of directors, shareholders, and things like that. Wolfson came in at that time and took advantage of what was then a cash cow, because during that time, the Capital Transit Company had accumulated a large amount of cash reserves during because of carrying so many passengers during the war. But with the declining ridership, you start to see an increase in transit fares. You start to see an increase in wages, but you also start to see an increase in operating costs to run these streetcars and buses. And so during the Wolfson time, you start to see service cuts. You start to see a kind of a general change in the shift of the attitude of the company at the time, going from really trying to be a community leader and working with the community and serving the community. The perception being that during that time, the company starts to change. And so the animosity between Congress, the DC government, and the Capital Transit Company starts to heighten, which would ultimately lead to a transit strike in the mid-50s. But also you start to see this continuing of cutting back of service, not just of cutting trips, but also cutting the service back along lines. In 1949, the line operating out to Beltsville is also cut back. So you start to see, again, this cutting of service and the kind of trimming of I almost thinking of it as like pruning a tree. You start cutting these little branches off over time that would ultimately lead down to the trunk of the tree itself. And then, by that point, it's almost too little too late. Beginning in 1958, though, so between 1955, you had a large transit strike that would suspend service, streetcar and bus service in the District of Columbia in the summer, roughly, I believe, starting on July 1st until August 21st of 1955, there was a transit strike. The end of the transit strike would result in the lifting of the franchise agreement for the Capital Transit to operate. And then the company is essentially put up for sale. And it was determined at that time, because at this time you start to see the development of the interstate highway system as well. So with the signing of the Interstate Highway Act in the mid-50s, the question then becomes, well, what is the role of the electric streetcar, and whether it should still continue? So by the mid to late 50s, it's believed that buses are seen as more flexible, cheaper to operate. And so between 1955 and 1958, you start to see in earnest this kind of push to abandon the streetcar system in favor of buses. The first of these lines, of course, was the Route 80 and 82 in 1958, resulting in the last line operating in 1962. As I had mentioned earlier, with the increase in auto ownership during the war, if you can see, by 1955, I think in 1950, the auto registrations in the district stood at around 382,000. And then by 1955, they had increased to 466,000. So you can start to see really the decline. And we often hear at the museum and other places that there was a conspiracy between General Motors, Firestone, and Goodyear to come in and purchase streetcar companies and convert them over to buses. While that was true in some cities, or a number of cities, in Washington, National City Lines did not purchase the Washington streetcar system, although it was one of the people that did put in a bid to purchase the company in 1955. That was ultimately not how it was not. That was not how streetcars left Washington. It was actually very different. with the end of streetcar service. So, it was just seen that streetcars by that point were considered antiquated. Buses were newer, faster. They had air conditioning. Some of them did. So they were just seen as generally better, although that was not always the sentiment shared by the riding public. As you can see, these were the years when streetcars really were being converted. So the Route 80 and 82 in 1958, the 20, 30, and 70 in 1960, the Mount Pleasant line, routes 40 and 42 in 1961, and then the final lines in 1962. And then the image that you see here on the right here, the streetcar lines, this actually came from a report that was done in 1955 on a proposed inner freeway. It was referred to as the inner freeway that would have surrounded downtown Washington. And you can see the lines that would have been affected by that proposed freeway, and the Route 82 and 80 and 82 are definitely on there. So streetcar service ends in 1962, but that's not really the end of rail in the DC area, of course. We know at the time that streetcar service was ending, there were already plans in place to build a heavy rail metro system that would some places replace streetcars, but also reach farther out into the region, primarily to serve these new, these kind of growing suburbs and bring people from these outer suburbs into the nation's capital. Of course, I'm referring to as Metro. Metro, of course, I think construction began starting in the late 60s with the first line opening, or portion of the red line opening in the 1970s. And through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you start seeing the building out of the original system. Of course, the green line, or the portion of the green line that would operate out into Prince George's County, would open in the early 1990s. And then that would, with the southernmost portion of the green line down into the other part of Prince George's County, being completed in the early 2000s. So that was one rail project. Of course, there was a second rail project, which was, of course, the DC streetcar. By the 80s and by the late 90s and early 2000s, it was evident that the cost of building these heavy rail metro systems was becoming more cost prohibitive. And there was also an attempt to kind of look at communities within the city of Washington again and reinvigorate and redevelop these new communities. And one way to do this was through the reintroduction of streetcars. So unlike earlier times when streetcars would have been built to operate farther out into these new trolley suburbs, this time the streetcar was being reintroduced as a circulator, if you will, within these kind of new, more, I guess, developing neighborhoods, or I guess what they would call now gentrifying. But this is a photograph of one of the DC streetcars being offloaded in Baltimore in 2009. Of course, service would not begin until 2016. But so that was a couple of the things. But then the other thing is, well, what happened to the alignment of the Route 82 streetcar? It would also get a new life, of course, as the Rhode Island Avenue Trolley Trail, which is one of the, of course, what we know as the trolleys to trails movement across the country of converting former rail lines into walking paths and bike paths. So I'd like to say that the trolley trail, it still serves, even though streetcars don't operate on it anymore, it still serves a role in that it connects the communities within Prince George's County and allows people to kind of move back and forth kind of in their own way. You don't have to jump in your car to drive places. You have other options on how you want to get through there, through to these different communities. So that concludes the first portion. I think I went a little over, but I did want to kind of stop here and kind of open up the floor and see if we had any questions. I don't know how we want to do this, but I'd be happy to answer any questions before we move on to the communities portion. So I don't know, Carter, if you want to.
Actually, this is Lisa, and we do have a number of questions in the chat, which is how we told people we would take them. So let me just see here. I was struck by the number of lines that originally owned part of, I guess, the Rhode Island line or the 82 line. And the question is, how did they get their money, and did people have to pay each one of them, or were there payments made to them by the city, or how did that work?
So, do you mean like if you were a passenger, and how did you,
Yeah, I
pay
mean,
your fare?
didn't they build certain portions of it? So did the money go to those lines, or did it, yeah, if you were a passenger?
In some cases, so if you look at, and I'll keep this to streetcars in Washington, in some cases, if you were a passenger and you had to ride, let's say you had to transfer, there was no transfer. You actually had to pay another fare to ride, if you needed to ride, to another portion of the city on a different streetcar line.
Right.
In the case of the Rhode Island line, if you look at some variations of this, sometimes the lines weren't always allowed to operate all the way into the city, because one thing I didn't mention here was because you had the use of the conduit system within Washington. So you didn't have the use of overhead electric wires, even though the Eckington was originally built with that. So you'd have to get off the streetcar from one mode, from an electric, powered from overhead wire, and then transfer to a streetcar that would be operated on conduit power. And so in those cases, you might have to pay another fare. And that's why these mergers were so important, because while these were new technology and was great and it attracted a lot of riders, one of the original complaints was that, well, every time I want to go to a different portion or I have to transfer, I have to pay a whole other fare. So with merging these companies together, you start to see these, kind of a unified fare system. You start to see the issuance of tickets or transfers, paper transfers, so that really kind of encourages increased ridership, because you don't have to pay that fare every time you need to change to get to a different portion of the city.
Great. There was a question about the B&O Railroad line, which I think operates along where the WMATA Red Line, where the Metro Red Line is. Was that ever used for public transit? I guess the question was. Was it ever used, I guess, for as a trolley line?
So the B&O line?
Yes.
So the B&O line was actually built before the trolley line. So when, I think the B&O was, originally incorporated in the 1830s and, reached Washington. So it had always been a steam railroad line, and I guess later other powers. But when you look at the construction of the trolley line, it was actually built in competition to the B&O Railroad. So there's a quote that I'll read. I think it's a little later in there, but it talks about specifically how the streetcar line was constructed. Because if you think about it, the trolley line is relatively straight. And so the idea was that in the city, it would operate, on whatever city speeds it would run on. And then once it got past the district line, they could open up and run as fast as possible, because they wanted to compete with the steam railroad. They wanted to compete with the B&O in terms of time. And that wasn't an uncommon thing. You would often see interurban lines, which are streetcar lines that would operate between cities, would often operate parallel to existing railroad lines. And some of the stops would be identical. They would have the exact same stops.
Right.
So you have some redundancy in the service.
So that would be right along Fort Totten, Brookland, Rhode Island Avenue into Union Station, or into that area?
It would have been, so the trolley line would have paralleled Rhode Island Avenue primarily. So, it went out Rhode Island Avenue in the street until it reached Hyattsville. And then at Hyattsville, if everybody knows Hyattsville, there's that split where, Route 1 kind of veers off to the left, and the trolley line would actually continue straight on. It actually ran to the side of Rhode Island at that point, but at that point, they would actually split off. But the main difference was, while the B&O would take you into Washington to, what would ultimately be Union Terminal, if you came in on the train and you needed to get somewhere else in the city, you still had to get on a streetcar or something to get into downtown itself. Whereas riding the streetcar line, if you were along any of those same places, would get you farther into downtown Washington. So it might get you into the center, at least as far as the Treasury building, which was, pretty much right in the center of downtown. So your options for transfers at that point were a little bit better. And you may not even have to transfer. You could ride all the way into downtown and then walk the rest of the distance to your final destination.
Right. There was a question, this is a little bit off the sort of the Route 82 question. There was a question from about trolleys in the port towns of Bladensburg, Colmar Manor, Cottage City, and Edmonston. They've had railroad tracks since the early 1930s, and the person was curious if those railroad tracks or wait influence the streetcar track path. It also, she said, it
I
always.
do know, well, I do know that there was, that streetcars did operate out to Bladensburg even before they actually operated out along, Rhode Island Avenue and into Prince George's County. Oftentimes, the development of the streetcar line would be associated with a real estate development too. So, and I probably have to research this one a little bit more, but oftentimes when we talk about the construction of the Route 82, these communities in some cases were already existing. There was already, Hyattsville was already there, and these other communities were already there. But what happened with the streetcar line was that now these communities could be promoted as, you could buy off parcels of land, develop these areas into, developments, homes, businesses that were a little bit more local. Same thing happened with the railroads, but oftentimes the development would be centered around the railroad station itself. Mm-hmm. And sometimes with the streetcar lines, the development would be associated as close to the car stop itself too. But the streetcar line might have multiple stops within a community if it was large enough. So you've mm-hmm. got these different, multiple places you can get off. But I do know that streetcars did go to Bladensburg, and I believe that they did operate out to like places like Cottage City and things like that too.
Right, they would be before. So I think you touched on this, but Darren asked, did the decline in ridership drive the dismantling of the streetcars, or was it the other way around? And also, who were the decision makers behind the choices to remove the tracks and scrap streetcars in this region?
So the decline, it was almost kind of like a chicken and egg thing. But what started happening first was you started to see a decline in ridership, or in some cases, the projected ridership never materialized. As I said earlier, these were often speculative. So they would build these lines with the assumption that, if we build it out to this point, if you build it, they will come. And in some cases, they never did. Mm-hmm. And so what happened is almost as soon as these lines started operating, or at least portions of them, they were really never able to kind of cover their costs. Mm-hmm. And at the time it was okay, they could kind of limp along, but then if you had any kind of economic shocks, keep in mind, a lot of these lines or companies were formed in the 1890s. And so you had a number of, panics Sessions, in the 1890s, right. Of course. So any economic, downturn would just kind of finish these companies off kind of early on. So even though the line may have existed, for a couple of decades, the company that built it may have only lasted for a few years before they were, had to declare bankruptcy and then get bought out. Mm-hmm. So if we use the line going out to Laurel as an example, the line reaches Laurel in 1902. The assumption is that there would also be a line built from the WB&A's electric interurban would built over from Annapolis Junction over to Laurel. That never happened. You had a number of, kind of mills and factories, in the area close to, on the Patuxent River that would have generated ridership, but the costs never really, generated enough revenue to make sure that you could keep the company solvent. So the condition of the company may deteriorate, the condition of the equipment. So the ridership, in that case, it never really fully materialized to the point where it needed to be to keep the company afloat. So then they start to cut it back. But then with the 1920s, when you start seeing automobile ownership, that started really to cut into the ridership. So it was just really a slow, like I said, like a pruning of the system. So you start cutting the least profitable portions early on. So you start seeing those go in the 20s. The Depression kind of helps move that along in the 30s. And then you get the little bit of a break in the 40s, so whatever's still running in the 40s, they try to keep that running. But then after the war, that ridership declines now because you've got automobiles again. And so the operating costs because, and I'll try to wrap this part up, but the other piece was that in the franchise agreements, there were all of these conditions under which the companies could operate. So, in terms of who made the decisions on, how the tracks were pulled up and everything, in the district, it was, Congress would say to the company, you need to remove your tracks on these areas or, dispose of them somehow. And so by the 1950s, since DC Transit owned, all the right of way going out into to Prince George's County and into Montgomery County, it was still, Congress making the decision, like, you need to remove all of your tracks. And then the company also understood because they wanted to get rid of this, this as soon as possible because they had to keep the stuff on the books, and maintain it, even if they weren't running on it, from a public safety, perspective. Mm-hmm. So they would pull up the tracks and things often as soon as the lines had ended. And so that was also the reason. But it was really, like I said, it was kind of a chicken and egg thing. But if the company wasn't profitable, or the line wasn't profitable to begin with, it was already in a precarious position.
Mm-hmm. We do have a question about the green line going to BWI, but maybe since it's now 3:00, maybe we should go on to the next section and then come back to that question when you finish up. Okay.
Absolutely. So let me go on to the next portion here. Let's see if this is working. Hold on. There we go. Okay, so the next portion I wanted to talk about, of course, were the actual communities along the Maryland line of the Route 82. When in doing the research for this, I was looking through, I think the gentleman's name was John Merrickin, who was an author who wrote, he's probably most known for writing this book, Every Hour on the Hour, which was a history of the WB&A. But he also did a significant amount of writing on the development of the line out, the streetcar line out into Prince George's County. What I found in my research was that as the line was being built out, they had various zones for where the cars could operate. And so depending on how far you lived out would depend on how much you paid for your fare. So I believe from Mount Rainier out to the end of the line was a total of 30 cents, one way. So each zone was about 5 cents per zone. But these were some of the communities. So zone 1 went from Mount Rainier to Riverdale, zone 2 from Ramona to Lakeland, zone 3 from Berwyn to Powder Mill Road, zone 4 from Beltsville to Muirkirk, and then zone 5 from Conti to Laurel. And the main thing about this is that when the streetcar did arrive to these communities, it was considered a very big deal. There's a quote from a letter from, it was from the City and Suburban chief engineer, which was one of the streetcar companies. He was writing to the General Electric Company and talking about the streetcar line. And he said, quote, the character of service under which these cars will be run will be ordinary, city, suburban, and interurban. That is, the cars will come into the city and will run at ordinary speed, but out of the city, they will run at a very high rate of speed, as some of these lines parallel steam railroads and run in close competition with the same. So that goes back to your question from earlier. But this map here is from our archives here. This was actually part of a grade crossing study that was done in 1937. And I wanted to include it because it shows in as much detail as I've seen so far, the line operating from Mount Rainier, and you can see it from left to right, they had to break it up into different segments, from Mount Rainier all the way out to Beltsville at that point. It didn't include the portion to Laurel. But, what I want to say for these, I broke these down into each zone. So, for the section from Mount Rainier out to Riverdale, this portion was built roughly between 1897 and 1899. As I mentioned earlier, Mount Rainier was originally supposed to be the transfer from cars operating what was then called the Washington, Berwyn, and Laurel, which was one of the companies, but they only had permission to operate down to the district line, and then you would have had to transfer to another car to ride the rest of the way into the district. And then the photograph here is actually a photograph of an outbound car at Mount Rainier on what would later become Rhode Island Avenue. So you can see kind of what the nature of the environment was at that time. It was just a station, and then the cars would continue on out on open track. The other interesting thing about this was that Rhode Island Avenue, that what we think of as Rhode Island Avenue going out towards Mount Rainier, was actually built by the company. It was built as the right-of-way, and then they turned that right-of-way over to the district, who then widened it, and that's how it partly became Rhode Island Avenue. It was always projected that that would be extended that way. You know, it shows the line before it was extended out to Hyattsville and onto Laurel. And there were plans at one point to construct a power plant at Hyattsville that would have powered the WBNA, the Maryland line, and then also the Chesapeake Beach Railway. But that never happened. But the other interesting thing that I found out about this is if you look at these communities, you can almost chart the growth in population literally, you know, from about the early 1900s and 1920 up until, you know, the 1960s. And I think for example, for Hyattsville, the population in 1920 was at approximately about 2,700. And then by 1960, the population had grown to 15,000. So that was in some part due to the ability to get to places like, you know, Hyattsville and Riverdale and North Brentwood on the streetcar, because it made things just a little bit closer. The next zone, of course, was Zone 2, going out towards Ramona, College Park, and Lakeland. These communities were reached by 1899. You know, a couple of, you know, neat things about that was that, of course, you know, College Park, there was a stop, I think, at College Street, where you could get off and you could go to, you know, the University of Maryland, and then I think at the time the University of Maryland Stadium if you wanted to go see a football game. But of course, there was also different types of communities. So I like to highlight Lakeland here because that was a small African American community that was located just north of Paint Branch, and it, you know, kind of pre-existed a little bit before, you know, streetcars, of course, but it was really the arrival of the streetcar that kind of connected the Lakeland community to the district. And so, you know, people were able to get from places like Lakeland. They could walk to a stop that was near their home, board the cars, come into Washington, or if they just needed to go down as far as Hyattsville. So it allowed for greater mobility. The photograph here is from a fan trip that was actually taken in 1949. So this would have been probably looking at the end of the Beltsville shuttle. They would have chartered a car to go out that far. And this was actually taken at Lakeland. This was the only photo I've ever seen of the car at Lakeland. That was what was written on the back, so I wanted to include that here in the presentation. The next zone, going out from, you know, from Berwyn on to Powder Mill Road, this portion of the line was finally reached by 1900. And so from Berwyn on, it was double tracked going all the way out to Berwyn, and then at Berwyn, the line narrowed down to a single track. And then it would operate the rest of the way out to Beltsville and Laurel that way. But there was a power station that was built at Berwyn roughly around 1896. But the other interesting thing was, if you look at the stop for Daniels Park, I was reading, and I guess it says in the spring of 1907, talking about the kind of, you know, property development that went along with that. A gentleman by the name of Edward Daniels had actually purchased and subdivided about, I think, 300 acres of land that would have just been adjacent to Daniels Park, and offered free streetcar rides from downtown going out there. He would offer like a free lunch to prospective buyers who would buy up these parcels and build their homes there. And I think in some cases, I read that he'd offered like free lumber and built a station there. And of course, that station would become known as Hollywood. So it's really kind of tying, like, here's how some of these communities actually were developed. You know, they were actually truly built to entice people to come out from the city to live in these suburban communities. So I just thought that was an interesting, you know, thing to learn about the line itself. And then for Zone 4, going out through the original name of what I saw, the earlier name of Odell Road, of Beltsville, Eminville, and Muirkirk. This would have been constructed roughly between 1900 and 1902. And, you know, a couple of things was that Beltsville, the main thing about the Beltsville line was what was made it so interesting was where it crossed Route 1. This was always a big deal. And I don't know how well you can see the photograph, but if you look at the streetcar, and if you look at the number 84 on the left side of the car, and just above that, you can see this thin little bar, and that is actually an air whistle. These were the only cars that had air whistles on them on the system. And so as they approached Route 1, they would blow these air whistles to cross Route 1 to let motorists know that they were coming. So that was kind of a really unique feature of the line itself. And then, of course, going the final zone out to, going through Conti and out towards Laurel, this was reached by the City and Suburban by 1902. And they had, one of the things I did read about the line going out to Laurel and kind of how the line was really encouraging to promote the city itself was when the line did reach Laurel, there was the local press had declared, this is another quote, the citizens of Laurel were about to be realized. The little midway town had prospered, not only as a pleasant setting for the city worker who became a suburban homeowner, but also as an employment center for the surrounding country folk. Close by the trolley line were the Laurel Sanitarium, so you can see the sanitarium stop, Rosenfeld's garment factory, the big cotton mills of the Patuxent, and the iron foundry at Muirkirk, whose worker composed the daily ebb and flow of office commuters bound to and from Washington. And so it really kind of describes how these communities were brought together and how people could move along these communities. So you didn't always have to come all the way into Washington to do your business. There were businesses that existed along the right of way as well. So it really kind of drives home the notion of how streetcars can connect communities and also develop communities too. It's about 3:11. That was actually the end of my presentation there. So if we have more questions, we've still got more time. I can take more questions. I don't know how much more time we have, but I'd be happy to answer any more questions if there are more.
Well, we could go back to the Green Line to BWI, and
Absolutely.
What do you think about that?
I think now, is it the question of whether it will ever be built or not, or I think, it may be, if there's enough political will to make that happen, then it could happen. But I will say that now heavy rail projects are, seen as being, prohibitively expensive. So when you're building a heavy rail system, you're spending, several $1 million per mile. And I think when they looked at the construction of the DC streetcar, I want to put it somewhere around, maybe 15 to 20 million a mile. It may be less than that. But then when you're building a heavy rail system, especially if there's any tunneling at all, you're spending hundreds of millions per mile. And the best example I like to use is the Second Avenue subway in New York City, which had been on the books for over a century. But I want to say that I think it was costing like $1 billion to build 1 mile of subway. So you can see why, if there's going to be rail going from the district or from the end of the Green Line to BWI, there's a better chance, I would say, that it might be something like a light rail or bus rapid transit, because that's considered a cheaper option than building a heavy rail extension to Metro.
Okay, we have a question also. With the DC streetcar and the long delayed Purple Line, do you think we'll end up seeing a revival of streetcars in other places in the DMV?
Well, I think we'll have to see. One of the challenges to building streetcars, at least within the District of Columbia, is that you still have the prohibition on electric wires, overhead wires in the district. This was the challenge when we were reintroducing the DC streetcar. And so, people wonder, well, why doesn't the streetcar go west of Union Station? It stops right there. And that's in part because once you get west of Union Station, you have to have some sort of alternate power source. So whether it's operating on storage batteries or something other than overhead wire, or you may be able to build overhead wire in some short segments, but now it's whether or not the cars can kind of charge their batteries when they are touching overhead wire. I don't know about whether streetcars will continue in the DMV area. I know that there was a push for that, decade or so ago, because there was also one of the things that also drives these transit projects is whether there is federal money available to pay in some part for these projects. In the early 2000s, the FTA was putting towards money towards the development of streetcar technology. So you see these small companies like Oregon Iron Works that would have built a number of cars for some for the Washington, D.C. area, but also for other cities that were being subsidized in some way by FTA. And then the FTA was also supporting these small streetcar projects, new starts, small starts projects across the country because they were putting federal money towards that. Now that these systems have been built, now they've kind of moved on to BRT. That's kind of where the funding has come from now, going to now. And so it's a question of whether or not these systems will continue to grow. So now if there's a support at the local level, I would hope that there would be a growth of streetcar systems in the district, because it doesn't make sense to build this 1-2 mile line and it doesn't connect to anything else. So I would hope that would be the case.
There is a question about, is there any special stormwater management system that could accompany streetcars? That the writer imagines that electric and water need to be kept far apart.
So with the water issue, so streetcars can operate in water. That's as long as the water isn't deep. Primarily, what we say is, you have to, as long as you're not touching the overhead wire and the rail, you're kind of okay. And streetcars did operate in all kinds of weather. That was one of their benefits. So they did operate in rain, but they did not operate in floods because that was considered dangerous. One interesting thing I did see with my research, when they talked about the line as it was operating towards Laurel, I guess coming south, right before it reached Laurel, it did actually operate over a small dam. I think the shopping center is, I think, called Laurel Lake Center, or close to that. And there's just north of that, there's a small pond, which is kind of the remnant of what would have been this dam. The streetcar actually operated on that kind of edge portion, and they actually had to pay the city of Laurel for any flood damage as a result of the car.
Wow. Yeah.
So, but they could operate together, but they didn't, they wouldn't operate at any kind of floods or anything, because that would have been considered unsafe.
Right. So there is a comment, I think, and I guess I'll just lay alongside that. Aren't streetcars light rail? Darren says, strange overall to have scrapped a network of streetcar lines and gone instead to reliance on heavy rail. The former is much cheaper and can use an enormous road and street network that could accommodate more widespread service.
Mm-hmm. If you look at, I would actually direct people to the DC Department of Transportation's website, because they actually are starting to archive a lot of their planning studies from the 40s and the 50s. And when you start seeing what was being written about streetcars at the time, we can look at it in hindsight and see that, well, if they had kept this, if this system had survived maybe just 5 or 10 more years, this would be a great system to have. But the attitude at the time was that, streetcars cause traffic. So they thought, if you get streetcars off the street and you replace them with buses, you'll get less traffic. And then you also see that there was more of an affinity towards heavy rail systems, because they seem to more align with highway development. So you could put the alignment of the metro rail system down the center of the highway. So if you look at I-66 with the orange line coming in, from the west, that's not an accident. That was not an uncommon feature. And so it was really looked at that the streetcars were considered very antiquated. So putting more money into them and investing in them was seen as unwise. And also looking at the cars that were available, the PCC car was kind of it up until about the 1970s. So there wasn't a lot of new technology being constructed until you saw the 1970s, in part because of the federal government was putting money towards the development of, the Boeing cars and things like that. So there weren't a lot of companies that would have been around that could have built new equipment that could have kept these systems running. So you were looking at running PCC cars and keeping them running, and even though they were considered modern, the buses were still considered the favored option. I won't say better, but they were considered the favored option. But it was really about, if they had kept the network, it could have reached more communities, and you would have probably had less reliance on automobiles, so you didn't have to drive everywhere for every trip. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. There's a question about the last picture that you showed in 1900. Was that a baby in front of a woman on the left? Looks like a modern infant carrier.
Oh, let me see if I can go back here. Yeah. So, there's the baby right there, so right next to the gentleman. Yes.
Yeah,
and
but
then,
I don't know where the infant carrier is.
I'm trying to see.
Maybe over on the right.
Oh, on the right,
above the grill.
That is so that kind of wire mesh thing that you see is what's referred to as a life catcher, and it was designed so that if someone were walking in front of a streetcar, that life catcher would essentially scoop them up and prevent them from going under the car. But that also meant that there were sometimes you could put things in the life catcher. I recall reading an account of, I guess, a gentleman who lived on the Chevy Chase line, who would walk down to the car stop every morning and would actually ride in the life catcher coming into the city, reading his newspaper. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it was just an interesting little kind of thing to hear about. So it may have been very possible that they would have put the the pram or whatever on the front, because it would have stayed in there more or less as long as they didn't go too fast, and then take it out and then go on where they needed to go.
Marianne says, no, it looks like a small infant strapped to the lady on the left, on the far left. I can't tell if that's either, it looks like that or I'm looking because the picture is much smaller on my screen. Right.
Or if it's like some sort of a flower corsage or something like that, which, this photograph.
But there are 2 little feet below it, or unless that's part of her outfit. I can't. Yeah,
that would have been
large. That
I would have to look at a larger photo and see what that is.
Okay.
I'll have to research that one then.
Several people say they think that it was a bouquet. Lots of people thanking you for the presentation. I'm going to turn this back to Carter. And Carter.
Yeah, I just want to definitely thank Eric. This has been fantastic. I apologize. I did have a technical internet dropout in the middle, so that's why the recording stopped and started, and I apologize for that. But thank you so much. This has really, really been amazing and cool, and it's great to learn more about what was, and hopefully what will one day begin again. More of more streetcars around us, particularly with the Purple Line coming.
Right.
Yes.
Carter, can I jump in here though too? Sure. During the time when the recording went out was when you were talking about the impact of desegregation, and it would be really wonderful to have that on here if you would be willing to maybe do a voiceover on that section so we could do that. But,
sure, I'd be happy to. If you'd like to, maybe we can coordinate. And yes, but I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, that'd be great. But we'll get back to you on that. Okay. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Carter.
Yep.
I don't see any more questions, so everybody else is saying this is really fascinating. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome. And I will say, though, this only scratched the surface of what I was able to find out about this line. There is a lot of information about the Route 82 line. So hopefully this kind of piqued your interest. If there are any people that live in Prince George's County along the line, hopefully you saw your community on there somewhere. But I do say, if you do want to know more, please contact us here at the museum. We love talking about this and sharing this information. So if there's any aspect of that you'd like to know more, just by all means, reach out to us, and we'd be happy to help you.
Eric, can you tell people when the museum is open?
Yes, we are open right now on Saturdays from 12 noon to 5. We are located at 1313 Bonifant Road in Colesville, Maryland, not to be confused with Bonifant Street in Silver Spring, but we're located next to the ICC. And so, but yes, if you come out on any Saturday from noon to 5, somebody's always here.
I've been to it, and it's fantastic.
And then the website, of course, let me go back to that real quick so everybody can see it. It's www.dctrolley.org. And I think we've got our Facebook and Instagram, and all that is also on there too.
Well,
And hopefully, I think we'll hopefully be able to post this presentation on there too. I think we're still working that out, but we'd like to, if possible, put that up on our website as well. If anybody wants to see it again.
That'd be great.
awesome.
We should probably also mention that in that we have a brewery here in Hyattsville called Streetcar 82.
Yes, they've actually. I was talking to Carter about this. They had mentioned we actually had an event here a few weeks ago. We actually had some people from the brewery come out, and I think we're in talks right now to actually do this presentation again at the brewery. So
Very
we're looking
cool.
for that.
Okay.
So we'd love to do that and do that again as well.
Make sure to let us know.
Yeah, if you let us know, we'd be happy to help promote that out to everybody.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you again, Eric, and thank you everybody who joined us today. This has been fantastic. On behalf of Hyattsville Aging in Place, Helping Hands University Park, Neighbors Helping Neighbors College Park, and Explorations on Aging in College Park, as well as the City of College Park, want to thank you, and we hope that people will continue to join us for future quarter conversations. Our next one is coming up on November 12th, and it's featuring Dr. Robert Savick from the University of Maryland, talking about music and its relationship with brain health. So you can find out more about that on HyattsvilleAgingInPlace.org. Just look for the events and quarter conversation tab in our top menu. And thank you, everybody. We really appreciate you joining us.
Okay. Thank you again. Thank you for inviting us to participate.
Thank you.
Great. All right. Guess I'm going to sign off. So everybody have a good afternoon.
Take care. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.